Başlayalım. Önce fragman girmiyor mu? Okey. Bir şey söyleyeyim. Önce fragman girmiyor mu? Honorable guests, ladies and gentlemen, I am honored to welcome you to the first international session of the Symposium. I am so pleased to be with you today at the Cinematic Ethics and Truth session and to have the chance to introduce our guests. Our first speaker is Piotr Szmuklako. He is a postdoctoral fellow at the Institute of Philosophy of Freie Universität Berlin. He earned his PhD from Tel Aviv University with the dissertation Heidegger's Idea of Art. His current research is concerned with theory and practice of philosophical art and film criticism, the work of Stanley Cavell, and philosophy of love. Shmuklakov is also the author of 2 published books of poetry in Russian and Hebrew under the pen name Petya Pita. He is going to give a speech called Alembadu on philosophical film criticism and romantic love. Please welcome Dr. Piotr Szmuklakov. Dr. Szmuklakov, we are at you now. If you can turn on your camera and start your speech, we will be glad. Thank you.
Do you hear me? Pardon, do you hear me?
Hello, Dr.
Yes,
Szmuklakov.
yes,
we can hear you very well. Thank you.
Hear me. Okay, great. Okay, I'll begin then. It's a pleasure, and it's a pity I'm not physically there. So, in my paper, I will present the theoretical setting of a big film philosophical project I'm concerned with for some time, which aims at a systematic philosophy of romantic love by the means of critical analysis of significant contemporary films. Significant in the sense that they, to my judgment, claim such analysis. These are films that call thinking. So indeed, the films that, from the claims of which to thinking this project began, but to which it is, of course, not confined, they also declare in their titles the love is the subject of their essential content that a philosophical analysis should produce. So like my first films were Love, Amour of Haneke and Love of Gaspar Noé, and Paradies Liebe of Seidel and Loveless of Zwagintsev, etc., etc. But so these films, they produce in a sense particular theoretical situations that declare that they're speaking about love, and there is an intuition that they have something important to say about love. But then an assumption of such a project, which is a version of like the big one of film philosophy generally, is how films can produce original philosophical content, philosophically relevant content, especially in case where love being a subject that philosophy were dealing with for a couple of millennia without any assistance from film. So what is the value of particular cinematic contribution? Now, this question is related to another issue. It's homological, I would say, with another methodological issue of phenomenology, that to produce some new philosophical content on any subject of experience, we must already have a certain notion of the subject. Heidegger called it the force structure of understanding as interpretation. So to philosophically explore art, I already need to know what art is, for example. And in this sense, like film declares that it will be saying something important about love. So I need to project already a certain conception of love in terms of which I would be able to formulate the specific content of the film. So to sum up, to pursue the exploration of love through philosophical criticism of film, I need to have two pieces of theory in my toolkit, two theoretical dimensions I need to articulate. First, I need a theory of love, some preliminary theory of love with which I can work, which will give me some my basic conceptual apparatus. And second, I need a theory of film criticism to explain how original content can be produced by a film, if the idea is already pre-given. Okay, I prefer to speak about the idea of love because I think that this, in a sense, points at the particular unity of the subject we're talking about, saying we have an idea of love, which in developed form is a conception of love. So I think that my both theoretical needs in such a project are best to be pursued with Alain Badiou, French philosopher Alain Badiou, who provides me with the best theory of love I know, and also with theory of cinematic content. And indeed, and this will be actually the focus of my talk today, the particular necessary relation between these two theoretical dimensions. So, Badiou on love, okay? So for the most part, philosophers and laymen alike think of love as a kind of subjective intentional attitude. Okay, usually when you ask someone what is love, he or she will say that it is a kind of emotion or feeling, and whatever whether we speak about it as desire, as care, as like whatever you think, as appreciation, as esteem, it has a certain relation of subject or experience of subject of an object, in a sense that it is intentional. So the great Badiou's idea is that... I'm sorry? Did someone say something?
That was one of the audience, I guess. But you can go.
Okay. So, according to Badiou's, like on the first glance, rather counterintuitive view, love is to be thought not as an emotion or not as internal experience at all, but as an event. Now, not denying that there is a subjective manifestation. Indeed, that's will be the interface of love, would be intense emotional experiences, of course, but they are not sufficient or adequate as a ground for philosophical description of this phenomenon. So we cannot adequately describe love in terms of subject's internal experience. Now, one way of finding some immediate support for this view in our intuitions would be to point that describing love in terms of intentional subject-object relation, Romeo loves Juliet, makes reciprocity and Juliet loves Romeo external to the core concept of love, and the experience of being loved a phenomenon hardly covered by this concept at all, which will be marginal, because when you ask someone what is love, usually a person describes what is to love someone. Although actually the experience of being loved is something that we, that's maybe the thing we value about love, or at least when we speak about like parental love, we first like experience being loved and then we learn to love. So for Badiou, the fact that it takes two for tango refers not to love's successful scenario, but to its primary ontological definition. Love is precisely this, and I quote it, Badiou, the advent of the two as such. So the two is the basic category of love. That will be the thesis of immanent two. And it's not like Romeo loves Juliet and Juliet loves Romeo. It's Juliet and Romeo as a one phenomenon. Now, but when he says that it is an event of the two, Badiou means a very particular kind of event, and so a word must be said about his metaphysical context of his metaphysical system, which is a very, of course, very elaborated and sophisticated one. So according to Badiou, love is one of four truth procedures, which is his name for the four domains in which any historical human reality, any world or situation acquires its basic parameters of intelligibility. Now, the four domains are art, politics, science, and love. And we're subjects in full-bodied sense, according to Badiou, only in force of our participation in some events of in these domains. Now, we already see that if we consider film, and certainly such project as mine does, as an art, love and film share fundamental metaphysical structure. So what does the structure consist of? So the event in this strong ontological sense is an occurrence, is an aggregating occurrence. It's actually, Badiou takes it from Heidegger's notion of Ereignis, which is sometimes translated as event of appropriation. So if normal kinds of, usual kinds of events we think of as occurrences in pre-existing coordinates of reality, the event of this kind is coming of such reality as a whole. Oh, I see I'm running out of time already. So yeah. Okay, so the point would be here that the two are not only the basic category of the amorous event, but the two are produced as what they are. The subjects are produced as what they are in the course of this event. But this coming to being of the world of the two, the world from the perspective of difference, as Badiou puts it, is not something that happens immediately, but it's a matter of duration. Hence, love is a procedure. So there are stages in this procedure. The first moment, the magical moment of encounter, that is actually an event, but it becomes the event of this kind only retroactively due to particular practice of the subjects, faithful subjects of fidelity, as he calls it, faithful to the event producing them. And endures in time. And then there is a basic ethical question of love, so this is this magical encounter that commits us to something, us lovers to something. But then what does it consist of? So usually the question about realization of love in the history, like throughout history, was answered with marriage and sexual consummation. Like Romeo and Juliet, they know what they need to do to actually realize their love is to have sex and get married in the opposite order for Romeo and Juliet. But then what is this marriage or this life together consists of? So Badiou says that love essentially is a reinvention of life. So the point of the amorous truth procedure, of the practice of which the two as two must engage, would be to invent, to discover what is exactly this practice consists of. Actually, this idea was articulated in Cavell without any relation to Badiou, is to say that, like in remarriage comedies, the point of marriage, there is like a conception of marriage when the essence of marriage is to discover what is the essence of marriage for this particular couple. Now, note that this the case-specific nature of the practice of love, the fact that some essential metaphysical content about it is produced, is specific to a particular couple, points at the significance of artistics, of its artistic, and as immediately I'll explain, cinematic exploration. So there is a reason why Cavell for instance, Cavell comes up with this theory of marriage through analysis of Hollywood comedies.
If we can wrap it up in a few minutes, because we are running. Sorry.
I'm sorry?
If you can wrap it up in a few minutes, it will be great because we are running out of time.
Really? In my clock, I have 6 minutes. I started in 50.
6 minutes.
Isn't it the case? I'm sorry. Thank
you. You can continue.
Yeah. I have a clock here. You see, that's. So now let's see. And finally, here's another thing that like amorous truth procedure is that since, as Badiou claims, any truth is eternal. So the question of love is the question how eternity can exist within the limited time span, which is to say that death, which is a very, very common feature of cinematic or literary love narratives, is inscribed in the very structure of metaphysical structure of love. So love must end, and its end must coincide with the death of at least one of the lovers. In a sense, when someone says "I love you," the vow of "till death do us part" already is entailed in this conception, in this declaration. So now, what is relation of this to film? So because Badiou says that film is a privileged artistic witness of love and the art of love. So we can say that the very thinking of love in terms of event and procedure invites the temporal medium for its representation, while its construal as a developmental succession of moments suggests narrativity, which happens to be the most widespread feature of the medium of film in its conventional cinematic existence. So to represent love is to represent a love story. Now, it is important, though, that since ideally, I mean, this narrative structure implies a closure, which is ideally death, such representation is inaccessible to an individual within the amorous procedure, the one participating in this amorous procedure. Now, another thing is that the objectivity of the cinematic gaze, the photographic objectivity of the cinematic gaze, works well with the idea of having, of the immanent two, because it enables to literally to have two in one frame without giving priority to any of the first person perspectives of the lovers. And that especially has to do with the sexual congress, when where literally two bodies are together as the two of difference. And this congress is actually inaccessible, again, from the first person perspective of each of the lovers. And this is why Badiou says that jouissance, the sexual pleasure, is unnameable or the inaccessible of the amorous truth procedure, and that it is as an art of the sexual body, the cinema is specifically the art of love. So just to wrap up, there's a lot of details to be added there, but the core of the way that love, the exploration of love is possible, or indeed is privileged in the medium of film, is that for one, that much of love, essential phenomenological content, is case specific. That is the discovery of what the truth procedure consists of, and that as such it is inaccessible to those participating in the procedure. So in a sense, film enables a phenomenological access, that is an access to a significant particular of love from the third person perspective. So that would be the core of this conception, and the detail that must be added has to do with Badiou's views on what is an idea, and specifically how an idea behaves in the context of cinematic representation. But that would be needed to live for. We'll need to leave that for another time. Yeah, sorry, and thanks.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Dr. Shmuklakov, for this fascinating speech. Now we will move on to the second talk of this session. Our next speaker is Dimitra Dimu. She's an alumni of the Department of Communication and Mass Media at the University of Athens. She specialized in cultural and film studies in her master's degree. She is doing a PhD at the same university these days, and she's writing a thesis about Kantian ethics in modern cinema. And she's going to make a speech about Kantian cinematic ethics. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dimitra Dimu. Dimitra, we are at you. If you can turn on your camera, we can also see you and start the speech.
Hello, everybody. Good afternoon.
Hello.
I was under the impression that it was gonna be in a different time, but it's okay. Did you get my PowerPoint? Am I able to share it with you with my share screen, or do you wish to do it for me?
You can share your screen on the PowerPoint. There's a screen share at the bottom of the page. You can share your PowerPoint presentation from there. We can see it.
Okay, I'm just looking for it now. Share screen. All right. Give me a minute, please.
Sure.
Can you all see the PowerPoint file beginning?
Yes, right now we can see it. There is another screen in front of us, but we can see the PowerPoint.
Yes, I see. I'm sorry. Oh. Give me a moment, please.
Sure.
Okay, I'm sorry for the delay, but I was under the impression that we're going to start in a while from now, but it's okay.
That's okay.
And thank you for having me. And I will start now my presentation on Kantian cinematic ethics by saying that the problem of recognizing and managing philosophical thought in the age of postmodernism lies in its multifaceted nature and sometimes in the multiplicity of concepts that make it up. The deconstruction of authentic concepts and the rejection on the enlightening modern demands for the autonomy of the scientific fields have redrafted the postmodern project into a demand in favor of liquidity, multiplicity, and diversity. And the modern misunderstanding of philosophy and its identification with a vast field of theoretical references that lacks a tangible framework of applications is probably also based on the morals of the postmodern era, which does not train the agent to use the in-depth study and consideration of a specific issue, but usually fragment the cognitive objects in terms of economics. After all, the postmodern state brings a kind of fragmented knowledge impossible to reconstruct into a whole. This fact, although it allows the agents to acquire specialized knowledge in different fields, prevents us from asking any question on a universal and unified understanding of reality. Traditional philosophical terminology, the concepts of morality or aesthetics, of good or beautiful, are in danger of being exiled as abstractions of rusty metaphysics. The real stakes and the modern draft of this research is the probable proof that philosophy in general and the classical Kantian view in particular are not necessarily far removed from our modern age and can be included in the most advanced in terms of material requirements form of art, which of course is cinema. At a time when the in-depth study of philosophy tends to be characterized as counterproductive, the search for alternative propagation of philosophical principles is a modern proposal. During this time of total crisis of any moral system, it is imperative that the average citizen, as a philosophical agent, becomes acquainted with the Kantian moral perspective and principles. The possibility of unrolling ethical philosophy in art in general is explored as a means of its dissemination and evolution. In particular, when the kind of art is the cinema and the terms of ethics are described through traditional philosophical references, it is not certain whether the classical philosophical conception of ethics can be reconciled with the advanced form of art. That is, whether philosophy can be written in the field of art of a means of here and now direct mass communication. Particularly, is modern art able to serve the principles of philosophy of one of the greatest, in objective terms, thinkers of all times, Immanuel Kant? The stakes are really not so limited. This question is really about the possibility of modern aesthetics and art to host and spread principles of philosophy with which the average citizen, spectator, is not familiar with. Over the centuries, there have been specific philosophical movements that have raised the question of whether and to what extent art is the place or the instrument of the truth, defining the boundaries between intellect and aesthetics. As in life, so in art and so in cinema, ethics is an important issue that determines the work of the creator and affects the character and the psychosynthesis of the recipients. Especially in modern cinema, the moral dilemmas that plague film heroes essentially reflect the anguish of the creator and the society as a whole over the determination of the moral, right, and debt, and the judgment of moral acts in general. Cinema is a relatively new medium of communication, the wider repercussion of which the great philosopher of the past centuries certainly did not have in mind when formulating their philosophical theories about ethics. The beginnings of cinema could be traced back to the birth of the moving image in the first decades of the 19th century. But in reality, cinema as a mass and organized phantasmagoria can only be placed a century later, and more specifically in the first decades of the 20th century. It is then that the cinema becomes a means of representing both ideology or propaganda, as well as everyday life scenes. Movies are then, for the first time, a massive product of art, making thousands of people around the world to line up in huge queues to get a ticket, fall in love, making thousands of people around the world to mimic scenes and memorize jokes and fall in love with movie characters. Unknown to most of the audience, references to classic film masterpieces or even commercial film producers, the unknown references to classical philosophical questions therefore raise the question of whether and to what extent this medium can be a field of application of traditional philosophy. So we're gonna go next on basic points of the Kantian ethics, saying at first that, of course, Immanuel Kant's contribution to the field of ethics has been fundamental and radical due to his pioneering approach to the issues of ethical behavior. Kant launches a new approach that proposes reason and logic and forms an ethical rather than a teleological moral philosophy. The moral debt, the duty, is dictated only by reason and logic and not by the results or the feelings, even if they are pure or well-intentioned. Without reason or logic judgment, there is no morality. Morality as a product of logic is, according to Kant, the main feature of human nature. Man's ability to comprehend the world through logic is what makes him human. Kant does not demonize emotion, nor does he believe that its elimination should be sought. He believes that emotions may aid or hinder a moral behavior, but they are certainly not considered a solid basis for his philosophical basis as well. For the first time, there's a clear distance from naturalistic conceptions, which dictate that morality is a natural property of the human condition. Kant speaks of the dolor of moral debt, since what practical reason demands is not always easy or pleasant, but is apt to make the human nature. Making a first contact with Kantian ethics, it's useful to mention the example of the kind-hearted man who acts out of pure instincts and innate benevolence. He is also recognized as such by Kant as a good-hearted man, but not necessarily as moral, since what moves him in action is not the devotion to his duty, but his natural inclination to the general good. The fundamental idea of Kant's ethics is related to the strict distinction between the categorical precept of moral law and the hypothetical precept of purely indirect purposes, with complete clarity and purity. This is a total rupture with any utilitarianistic conception of ethics. Satisfaction, but also dissatisfaction, cannot be recorded, according to Kant, in the field of ethics. Pleasure can roughly be described as an impression that varies in proportion to the external stimulus and is therefore infinitely variable. However, taking all these impulses under serious consideration, one will probably find a chaotic mass of different, intersecting, and repulsive tendencies, each of which, even when seemingly directed towards the same object, are qualitatively completely opposite. The desired universality that serves world harmony is obviously not about the universality of the desire for pleasure, but the free will to submit to a universal law. I'm sorry. The concluding proposition of the fundamental principle of critical ethics is the so-called type of the categorical imperative, the foundation of moral theory of Kant, which is defined through several formulations, from which I'm going to present you just the basic ones. The agent of the act must always act on the basis of such a principle that at the same time the agent may want this principle to become a universal law. The agent must act in such a way that the guide of his act becomes voluntarily a universal law of nature. Every act must highlight that the will that considers itself at the same time is a regular legislator. D. Every agent must act in such a way that he always treats humanity never only as means, but also as an end at the same time. And in this context, the agent must act as if he were always aware of a legislative member of the state of ends in themselves. Herein lies the very essence of categorical imperative and the principle of morality. Free will and will complied with moral laws mean the same thing and are absolutely identical. On the contrary, will and action are not free when they are determined by an individual given object of desire by a particular material stimulus. The freedom of will and moral act consists in the idea of the totality of the determinations of the purpose and with the claim that they are unified. Therefore, good for Kant is only the good will that come from contemplating duty, moral duty. Skills, luck, and even happiness could be used even for evil, not only for good. So goodwill is not only orientated towards this direction, but is driven by moral obligation as the universal legislator of humanity. Understanding Kantian ethics therefore presupposes the complete separation of the good, with the daily use of the term, from the right. The morality that is dominated by compliance with reasoning and logic seeks the right moral love is expressed by the concept of duty to humanity. On the contrary, love that springs from emotion is, according to Kant, a pathological kind of love and has nothing to do with any form of moral act. Given the Kantian formula of humanity, many commendable and heroic acts of cinematic characters may now be viewed under a different light, with the possible result of the deconstruction of the heroes and the questioning of their morality. Starting with the question of whether Kant's absolute, super-social, super-class moral law may apply to the contemporary art of cinema, examples of the application of Kantian ethics to cinematic practice through references to classic or modern cinematic creations will be used. Cases of moral dilemmas in cinematography are not uncommon. In Kantian light, they do not even seem accidental. Seen from the Kantian point of view, the deeds that elevate the heroes and break out purification could potentially turn into unethical acts that do justify the feeling, but on a macroethical level, if applied as a universal law, would harm humanity. Starting from the Saving Private Ryan example, it is an example of utilitarian rationalism rather complicates than solves the ethical issues when given the importance to numbers. But in this case of this film, Saving Private Ryan, the value of sending a military unit under the command of Captain John Miller, Tom Hanks, to Normandy in order to locate and rescue a soldier whose 3 brothers have been killed during the war is disputed on the basis of the principle of benefit. even by the members of the mission themselves, in harmony with Havel's view that according to Kant's philosophy, disobedience in general is a natural tendency of rational beings. The soldiers, faced with the growing dangers of the mission, wonder why 7 people have to go at risk with their lives for a single stranger. The mission leader, Miller himself, exclaims at one point, "I hope this Ryan is worth it. He'd better come back home and cure some disease or invent something unique." Miller's reasoning seems purely utilitarian, but we realize that when the benefit on a hypothetical basis is not enough for the moral basis that a suicide mission needs in hostile lands, if we assume that Ryan will deliver more happiness compared to the hardships and misery caused by the mission to rescue him, then the mission is considered morally justified. Who can discount this outcome? The practical difficulties of this calculation, the impossibility of quantitative comparison of qualitative quantities, such as happiness and misery, shake the basic argument of utilitarianism. That is, the absolute principle of happiness as a basic moral principle. In addition, defining the concept of happiness as opposed to the concept of pleasure creates further obstacles to the practical application of this moral theory to realistic data. But if the mission is approached in terms of its moral part, based on different types of questions, such as, is a world in which a human life is evaluated numerically in terms of its rescue moral, or is it moral state whenever a person is in danger to be left on his own for fear of collateral loss during his rescue? On the basis of similar mental questions and experiments, a multifaceted philosophical dialogue has been developed. Using a well-known paradigm, the ease of obligation to rescue the largest group of potential victims against whom a railway vehicle is headed, directing it to an alternative route where the victim is one innocent person, is a popular field of philosophical discussion, named as Trolley Problem, in the context of dual effect theory. This example of utilitarian rationalism rather complicates than solves the ethical issues that arise in relation to the numerical quantities of its utility. This or any other question of a similar nature could in itself be considered immoral as kind of moral provocation. However, this is not the only problem that concerns this question. The state of emergency that is passed on to the moral agent seems to be placed before the absent critical moral parameters and possibly addicted to a pseudo-scientific way of moral thinking and argumentation. This is a case of the example's misuse, and it is opposed to the example that Kant uses only under certain conditions in his philosophical discourse. The dividing line between the example as a wheelbarrow of perception and the example as an arbitrary standard prohibits the invocation of fixed examples to guide behavior. If we ignore the relevant nature of invoking such mental experiments and enter into the process of further analysis, we realize that the figures are rather disorientating the moral direction of actions, although the moral principle in favor of most has several supporters. However, from the Kantian point of view, and specifically on the basis of the distinction between dignity and price as a replacement value, it is impossible for the person to be reduced to a substitute. In fact, when even the case of using at least one as means of defense or rescue the most, it is doubtful whether it can be distinguished from homicide. If we have to make a distinction in this regard, it will simply be a gradation of the unworthiness of using the face as means. The consequentialist nature of the question is at odds with the Kantian view. While coercive moral blackmail, on the one hand, attacks our integrity, and on the other, is rejected as untestable as it presupposes a misleading conflict of duties based on the Kantian sense of duty law. In the case of this example, There are no conditions for holding duties in this strict but clear sense. The scientific validity of such methodological questions is therefore questioned, as they place the moral judgment at the basis of the result. Departing from the consequent...
We are running out of time, so if you can finalize in a short note.
Okay, let's just move to the conclusions, and my text will be available to all interested. So in view of the presented material that I had the chance to give to you and other that will be available for those interested, the question of whether philosophical theory finds potential application in any time of film production beyond the commonly accepted as quality and respectable cinematic genres no longer seems to have an easy answer. Certainly, philosophical references find a richer field of application in the category of films that have been supervised by intellectual directors with a similar background. However, this reality encloses rather than excludes a plethora of mainstream cinematic creations that paradoxically, as well as effortlessly, raise a number of the most important philosophical questions of all time. The logically next assertion that perhaps a rudimentary ingenuity would suffice for any film to be connected to philosophy is not entirely unfounded. In these cases, the extortionate attempt to diagnose a philosophical background is rather obvious. Of course, it is not necessary to impose a meaning on a film that does not aspire but to visually represent an elementary script. It always takes precedence to read the context of the film itself. In fact, the question of whether the creator intended from the beginning to raise philosophical issues through the filmmaking is ultimately minor. The real significance and value lies in the fact that even unintentionally, it seems that it is possible to read traditional Kantian philosophy in the often disputed popular Hollywood movies. And this opens a double window for both the modernization of philosophy and the future use of cinema, even in education films. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We would like to thank Dimitra Dimou for this great talk. And let us move to the next and last talk in this session. Our last speaker is Frederick Emil Fries Jacobsen. He holds an MA in Philosophy, Art, and Social Thought at the European Graduate School. He wrote his thesis, The Birth of Parody, in 2019, and he's a CanMag in Philosophy, the Department of Media, Cognition, and Communication at the University of Copenhagen. In this session, he is going to make a speech called Poetic Truth. Please welcome Frederick Emil Fries Jacobsen.
Thank you. Thank you all. Let me just get my things in order here. Can you all hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, fantastic. Well, let me begin by saying thank you to you guys for organizing this event, and thank you to my co-panelists for some very interesting talks. I had to go get coffee at some point. It was such a shame. It was really interesting. But yes, today I'm going to be talking about what I've called poetic truth. I'll be talking about the German film director Werner Herzog, who I know is often discussed among film critics and also among philosophers. But I'll try to at least give a sketch of what I think is possibly a new spin on things, a new approach to some of the concepts that he creates and introduces to explain at least his own oeuvre, but perhaps something more general about cinema. And the locus for this reading, the text I'll be talking about, because it will be about a text first and foremost, is his famous Minnesota Declaration, his Lessons of Darkness that he presented in 1999. And just to give a quick bit of context to it, these declarations, or this declaration, was made in the aftermath of quite a bit of controversy. Herzog released a film called Lessons of Darkness in the early 90s, which was screened, among other places, in Berlin. And when it was screened in Berlin, he was heavily criticized, spat at, yelled at, and had an altercation with people at the festival. And so, as a sort of a reply to those who he didn't feel understood what he was doing, he made this declaration. He wrote this text, which is essentially a manifesto and a polemic and a poetics at the same time, that sort of deals with the quarrel he has with what he calls cinema verite, which we should not understand as the specific genre of cinema verite. You could indeed find plenty of film directors in that genre who would probably agree with what Herzog is doing. But it's his name of this a particular approach to image making, one that journalists and 24-hour news cycle TV stations make use of, and certain documentarists, though he never names names. But let's start by looking at, I've picked a couple of the points from the declaration, and these are sort of the more polemic ones, where he polemicizes against what he calls cinema verite, and that idea of image making's particular attitude to facts and truth, and facts as constituting something true. I'll read them quickly because we have a lot to go over. But as it says, by dint of declaration, so-called cinema verite is devoid of any verite, reaches merely superficial truth, the truth of accountants. Then has this example of the attitude with the idea that you could just sort of point your camera at things, and then some kind of truth will be revealed by that. The camera, the image, or the photograph, if you will, is this sort of passive medium that things just essentially photograph themselves onto, and then that reveals something true about them. Further, he states that cinema verite confounds fact and truth. Essentially placing factual information or staging factual information as true information. If like these are the facts, then that is the truth, and that is all there is to it. He's not blind to the power of facts, as he writes in point 4. Facts create norms. Facts are very powerful, but illumination is something that is that truth is privy to. And then, the last two ones, I just took them because I like them. I think they're great polemic statements, that these filmmakers who love facts resemble tourists. They just walk around and photograph things, but they don't engage with anything. They don't engage with the stuff that they want to depict in their cinema. And then the last point here, that the moon is dull, that Mother Nature doesn't call to you. Essentially what he's saying here is what I said in a different way just before. Nature, for example, does not reveal itself in any true form just by you pointing a camera to it. More must be done. And that is what we get to now, which is, here is sort of the polemic aspect of the declaration, but there is also the outlines of a poetics present here, which is, we have here in point 5, which I'll read aloud too, where Herzog says that there are deeper strata of truth in cinema, and there is such a thing as poetic and ecstatic truth. This truth is mysterious and elusive and can be reached only through fabrication and imagination and stylization. Yes, and these are the things I've highlighted in red here. These are, of course, the things that I'll be talking about today, and that I will be trying to not give an explanation of, only kind of, but also trying to show where this might come from, what might be the philosophical ancestry of these points, but also to show that, and I'm going to be talking about Aristotle just in a second, how Aristotle's distinction between, not between accountant and poet or cineast here, but for Aristotle, the distinction between historian and poet, and those two different realms of truth, of work, is, in my eyes, a very good way of explaining what Herzog is on about here. One slide that I just skipped is that I wanted to show, I'll be talking a little bit about Nietzsche as well, but I'll keep it brief because there's only so much time. but that at least the polemic side is very clearly inspired by Nietzsche, the young Nietzsche that writes on the uses and disadvantages of history for life, where Nietzsche declares war on the idolatry of the factual. The factual is always dumb, as Nietzsche says, and he wants us to rise against the blind force of facts, like blind force of facts, force in like facts create norms, and blind as opposed to stuff that is illuminated, as opposed, Herzog would say, to truth. But yes, those things underlined in red here is what I'll be talking about mostly, trying to explain what does it mean that the truth of cinema or of art is deeper in any sense than the factual truths that are available to us. How is this truth poetic and ecstatic, as he says? How can we understand that? And then finally, how are we to understand that this is something that is reached only through fabrication and imagination and stylization? I've just a few quotes here that I wanted to put in to show that this is something that Herzog has always been on about. It's at its most poignant in the Declaration, but it's something he talks about elsewhere. So, I mean, the first quote here is essentially a replica of what he said in the Declaration, only now he's expanded it to cover arts, music, and literature, as well as cinema. And he's added the notion that it needs to be effort. But otherwise, it's exactly the same. And then just to elaborate on this cinéma vérité idea, that he says that these truths can penetrate deeper, specifically than CNN ever could. So that, again, showing that cinéma vérité, when Herzog uses it, should not be confounded with a particular genre of cinema, but rather with a particular genre of producing or making images. Images that seek to document, as read, to journalize and to archive, images that Herzog is vehemently against. If one watches, for instance, the interviews with him in Les Blancs, Werner Herzog eats his shoe, where he talks about that we need to declare holy war against inadequate images, we should replace them with, and the job of the film director should be to produce better images of our civilization, something that he almost word for word repeats in Wim Wenders' Tokyo Ga, where he's interviewed in the top of a radio tower. Both fantastic little short films that you should all enjoy, whether or not you're interested in Herzog, but if you are, then they are particularly poignant. All right. Yes, sorry, here's a still from Tokyo Ga, where he's talking about, it's translated as sparse here in English, but it's adäquate Bilden, so it is adequate images that he's talking about. Yeah, do you follow my screen sharing? Can you see that I'm changing slides, or do you just have the front page? Because that's what it looks like on your screen.
We're just seeing the front page.
Oh, that's sad. Okay, well, I hope you can follow what I'm saying then. I don't know what to...
You're following. It's okay.
Okay, fantastic. Otherwise, I'll be happy to share like all the... I'll be reading a lot then. Apologies. All right, so what does this all mean? What does it mean that cinema can produce or reach a strata of truth that is poetic and ecstatic? How is it deeper than the so-called factual truth of accountants? And what does it mean, or in what sense is it only obtainable through fabrication and stylization? First, a final little nod to Friedrich Nietzsche. Herzog, in a different text than the Declaration, talks about truth and reveals himself that he takes his notion of truth from ancient Greek philosophy, namely the notion of aletheia. And he writes that the Greeks meant to define truth as an act of disclosure, and that is a gesture that is related to cinema, in which an object is set into the light, and then a latent but not yet visible image is conjured onto cellulite, where it must first be developed and then disclosed. So here, specifically in relation to cinema, a protest against the idea that it's sort of a passive medium that the world can just be sort of imprinted upon. It's an active medium. You conjure up the image, you develop the image, and it's through this conjuring and development that truth is disclosed. And that seems in a way to be an echo of something that Nietzsche is writing, and Nietzsche is writing here specifically about photography and that way of producing images. Nietzsche writes that about the folly of us supposing that things, as it were, photograph themselves by their own action and on a purely passive medium. This would be mythology, and bad mythology at that, Nietzsche writes. And just finally, before I get to Aristotle, I've realized when doing the research for this that there should be more research into the connection between Nietzsche, the younger Nietzsche, and Herzog. The more I read into this, the more clear it became that there is a connection here that is, to me, looks undeniable, but of course needs to be looked closer into. It's not just something that you can pass it and then say, oh, well, Herzog's a Nietzschean. But anyhow, Nietzsche writes, again, as something that seems to be a Nietzschean poetics of the relationship between image and truth, or what the image should do, about paintings, this time not photographs, but that the painting can be or is artistically true, but certainly not historical. What a painting does in the painting, it's not the facts, but their fabric and connection with each other that's added. So that is what the painting or the conjured image does. It doesn't care about facts, it cares about connecting things, or it cares about the ways that a certain thing is connected. And then sets out to maybe reconnect it in a way that's different from the way it's factually fabricated or connected to other things. And finally, Nietzsche writes that we could think, or we could imagine, a historiography that had in it not a drop of common empirical truth, and yet could lay claim to the highest degree of objectivity, or to say this in Herzog's vocabulary, that could lay claim to the deepest degree of truth. So that's it for Nietzsche. I'm gonna move into Aristotle now. It's really a shame that you can't see, follow along in the PowerPoint, but I'll read out as best I can. So first off, sorry?
If you'd like, you can close the file and then reopen it, maybe.
I'll try that, and I'll keep talking in the meantime. So can we in good faith, that seems to me a relevant question, can we in good faith even begin to talk about cinema with our base in Aristotle's Poetics? I mean, obviously this is not a book that in any way, shape or form discusses cinema explicitly, right? Let me see if this is better. Boom, 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 boom. No, it seems you have even less of a view of what I'm doing now. All right, never mind. But can we talk about Aristotle's Poetics? Can we use it to talk about cinema? Is that even a possibility? And I think we can. There's two important things to note here in order for this to work. First of all, what does Aristotle say about poetry? All forms of poetry, all forms of poiesis, as it is, which essentially means something that's created, but it's also specifically in this book something that's poetically made. And what he writes is that there are all, in their unique way, forms of imitation, forms of mimesis, I think is the way you say it in English. Mimesis is how I would say it without thinking about it. So that's sort of general, that's principle to all kinds of poetry. What he then goes on to say is that the different kinds of poiesis differ from one another in three ways, either by a difference of kind in their means, or a difference in the objects that they imitate, or in the manner of their imitations. And then he goes on to list several different ways in which this takes place. So some use form or color, and some use rhythm, language, and color again. Sorry, that's not supposed to say color, it's supposed to say harmony. Anyhow, what I think we could very easily draw from this is there's no reason that an imitative practice that uses images, but images infused with rhythm, with movement, should be a kind of poetic imitation that is also counted here. I mean, as I write here, cinematography, literally, it's moving images, it's images with rhythm. So I think it's very obvious that like the general points made in the Poetics count for any kind of image making, which would also be filmmaking, cinema. But then there's the problem of imitation, right? Because that sounds wrong to us initially. Herzog is all about, we shouldn't let the facts decide what the images show. That doesn't sound like an imitative practice. That sounds like a more creative practice. And obviously also it would be silly to think of poetry as pure imitation. So in what sense does this imitation become more than just reproduction? How is it transformed into something else? And that happens, according to Aristotle, through this idea he has of mythos. He writes that a poet should be, strictly speaking, he should be more a poet or writer of his plots, mythos, than verse, right? Verse is, forget about that. The important part is making mythos. And what is that defined as? That is defined as the combination or the arrangement of the incidents. French philosopher Paul Ricoeur has put this very eloquently. He writes that what makes such an imitating, such a mimesis into a poiesis, that is into a productive activity, is the activity of arranging the incident into a mythos, into a plot, the activity of emplotment, and defined as the arrangement of the incidents. So it is because the poet rearranges what is immediately in front of him or her that we are dealing with poiesis. We're dealing with creation rather than with mere reproduction. All right, now that is the chief task of the poet, is to write mythos, is to arrange or rearrange the incidents. And here's where Aristotle goes on to make a distinction that I think is very, very close to the one that Herzog makes. It's less polemic, it's much more terse. It is, after all, Aristotle we're dealing with. But Aristotle writes that the poet's function is to describe not what has happened, but a kind of thing that might happen. Let me just get rid of this, sorry.
For interrupting, but we are almost out of time, so
okay, I'll be quick. I can be quick. The poet's function is to describe not the thing that has happened, but a kind of thing that might happen, i.e. what is possible or necessary. Poetry statements are of the nature rather of universals, whereas those of history are singulars. And by a universal statement, Aristotle means one that talks about what such and such a kind of person will probably or necessarily say or do, which is what poetry is dealing with. That is universals. But a singular statement, which is the realm of history, or you might say of the accountant, is what, say, Alcibiades did or had done to him. In short, the poet is not to be bound by facts. The poet or the film director should not care about what actually transpired in some situation. It is his or her job or their job to rearrange things so that illumination happens, so that something new is learned. Aristotle further writes that the human being is defined as being the most imitative creature in the world, and the creature that learns at first and probably also best through imitation, that is, through this rearrangement of things around us. So the aim of the poetic poiesis, of the poetic mimesis, is to learn, to get a hold of new knowledge, or you might say to illuminate something, and in such a way that whatever it teaches us would not be immediately available to us. It would not be available to us at all without the poet or the film director arranging incidents in a way that disregards the factual, so that something, you might say non-factual, but in a sense still true, reveal itself to us. Something that Aristotle also finds at several points or connects to the activity of creating metaphors. So what the poet does when writing metaphors, I'll be quick here, but what he writes is that the best metaphor that he can think of, Aristotle, he writes this in the Rhetoric, is a metaphor that Gorgias has made, where he describes a woman not as she is, but in another way. So disregarding what this woman is actually like, but describing her through completely different means. When Homer describes Achilles, says that Achilles just describes him as a lion instead of as a man. When Homer calls age a withered stalk, he conveys a new idea, a new fact to us by means of lost bloom. the whole idea is by recontextualizing, by rearranging, by redoing things, we are granted access to something that is new knowledge to us. Something is illuminated, but it only happens because the author, the poet, the director completely disregards the factual state of things. How are we on time? Is it like 1 minute or is it no minutes?
We have run out of our minutes.
Okay, I'll summarize in 20 seconds. I'm sorry that I got out of time here, but just to quickly summarize, the point is what Aristotle is describing, which is what Herzog is banging on about, is that the poet's task or the film director's task is to rearrange the incidents, disregard the facts of the matter in order to reveal, to teach us or to learn us some new knowledge that would simply not be available to us without this poetic operation. And in this sense, this truth reaches deeper than the accountant or the historian ever could. This knowledge is poetic in the sense that it is made or produced, that this truth must be staged for us in some way. And it is ecstatic in the sense that it is out of stasis. It is something that must be moved into being or into view, something that never passively reveals itself, as Nietzsche and Herzog both talked about with images. And finally, this truth of accountants is what we learn from the historian. So the accountant for Herzog is the historian for Aristotle. But the disclosure of ecstatic truth is the task of the poet, or indeed the film director. I'm sorry that became a bit hectic, but I hope I sort of managed to sketch out a way of approaching Herzog that goes via Aristotle and Nietzsche, rather than the thinkers that are usually employed in reading him and in watching his films.
Thank you, Frederick Emil Fries Jacobsen. That was a great speech and it was breathless. And if you have any questions, we can ask them to our speakers. I guess we don't have any questions. Do we have it? If we have any questions, we can ask them. All right. I guess we don't have any questions, and we would like to thank all the speakers in this session for their marvelous contribution, and all the audience for to be a part of this. And we are ending this session here. So thank you and best wishes. Thank you.
Thank you.